She stood there while his family called her a leech, a climber, a girl from the wrong zip code angling for a last name that wasn't hers. They told each other she wanted a slice of Baker wealth and a house with a gate. Until the black single mom uncapped a pen in open court and signed away the one thing they thought she came for. Welcome, my beautiful family. Before we begin, please subscribe. Like this video and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Your support will help us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The first time Marcella walked into the baker's world, she should have known the weather, the way a cousin's eyes skimmed her thrifted coat at the holiday brunch, the way a fundraiser hostess said down to earth like it was a diagnosis, a condition to be managed, the way Edward laughed a millisecond too late when someone joked about marrying the South Side. But Marcella was building something real, and when you're building, you don't always see the demolition crew gathering around the foundation. Edward carried diaper bags without flinching. He called Brian my little guy with a catch in his voice that felt true. For a while, she believed it could be simple. A man, a woman, a baby who needed them both. Love rarely survives when a family treats its last name like a trademark. Edward Whitmore was everything she thought partnership could be. Thoughtful, present, willing to split the check and the truth. When they met at a tech fundraiser 6 months before Brian was born, he didn't know about Lighthouse, the emergency response platform she'd built from night shifts and stubborn hope. And she didn't mention the equity that was quietly vesting or the studio apartment where she debugged code while her neighbors' lives bled through the walls. They just talked about call center burnout, the architecture of Chicago's L platforms, and whether oat milk was a conspiracy or a kindness. It felt clean, untainted by the ledger-keeping that money always brought to relationships. She didn't know his mother kept ledgers on everyone, but families have a way of poisoning even the clearest wells. The whispers started at the first Baker family dinner. Marcella caught fragments when she excused herself to check on Brian in the guest room, voices that thought mahogany and Persian rugs muffled cruelty, but carried just enough for her to hear. She's clearly after the trust. Gold digger written all over her. Edward could do so much better. Each phrase landed like a pebble in her shoe, small, ignorable, until the walk home left her bleeding. She convinced herself she was being sensitive, reading malice into concern. Surely people with donor wings and museum galas weren't really that small, that presumptuous. She was wrong. Catherine Baker, Edward's mother, orchestrated the campaign against Marcella with the precision of a PR firm, because that's exactly what she used. At every family gathering, the comments sharpened, grew bolder. At a cousin's engagement party, Catherine seated Marcella at the children's table, then apologized loudly to the room. "Oh, I thought you'd be more comfortable there, since you're so good with Brian." When Marcella quietly moved to an empty chair beside Edward, Catherine tapped her wine glass, "C'est and announced to 60 guests that they really should formalize custody now, before emotions complicated things. The room fell silent. Phones came out. Edward's jaw tightened, but his mouth stayed shut. Marcella excused herself to the marble bathroom, where she could hear 2 bridesmaids laughing through the door. Bet she Googled how to trap a baker before the first date. But Catherine was just warming up. She enlisted a PR subcontractor, the kind you hire when reputation is worth more than truth, and an anonymous social media account was born. The account posted screenshots of Marcella's thrift store receipts with captions like, "Funny how secondhand becomes a lifestyle when there's a trust fund at the finish line." It shared a doctored text thread suggesting Marcella had strategically timed her pregnancy. The hashtag #GoldDiggerAlert started trending in Chicago philanthropic circles. Comments poured in, thousands of strangers picking apart her clothes, her neighborhood, her right to love someone whose family believed love was a risk to be managed, not a gift to be given. Harrison Baker, Edward's father, took a quieter approach. He hired investigators to scrub Marcella's past for scandal and found only hospital shift logs and a city contract for Lighthouse's pilot expansion. When the dirt didn't materialize, he cornered her at Edward's birthday dinner, his voice low and sharp as a scalpel. "Leave, my son, or I'll make sure you never work in this city again," he said, standing too close in the hallway outside the kitchen. "You think you can just walk in here and dilute what 3 generations of bakers have built? You're nobody. You have nothing. And if you stay, you'll have even less." The words hit deeper than any public humiliation could have. Not because they were true, but because they revealed what the bakers believed worth was measured in: gates, galas, and the ability to destroy someone just because you could. Edward, caught between the family that controlled his trust fund and the woman he claimed to love, began to crack under the pressure. The questions started small, almost tender. Why did she insist on splitting costs when he could cover things? What did her parents do before they passed? Where did she go to school? Each question felt like an audit wrapped in concern, a gentle peeling back of her life to check for rot. He started arriving late to Brian's pediatrician appointments, then missing them entirely. The man who once stayed up all night researching colic remedies now looked at her with something new in his eyes, not love, but calculation. The breaking point came when Edward handed her a folder across her kitchen counter, right between the bottle warmer and the breast pump parts that marked the landscape of new motherhood. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement, the tasteful kind, full of privacy language and brand protection clauses. "Just to protect us," he said, not meeting her eyes, "so we control the narrative." Marcella read it 3 times. The NDA barred her from discussing their relationship, her pregnancy, or his family online in any form, now or forever. It did not ask the same of the people digitally stoning her. "You mean you control the narrative?" she said, sliding the folder back across the counter. "And I keep quiet while your people call me a con artist." "Marcella, be reasonable." "I'm being a mother," she said. "Mothers don't teach their sons that silence is the cost of being loved." They separated 2 weeks before Brian was born. Edward visited the hospital, held his son with shaking hands, cried into Marcella's shoulder, and promised he wanted to be present. She believed him, believed the tears, if not the follow-through. But the custody proposals that arrived from the Bakers' attorneys were heavier on optics than diaper schedules, more concerned with photo rights than feeding times. Marcella kept her own folder, the one labeled Brian. Vaccination records, pediatrician notes, sleep logs, a playlist of lullabies that worked when nothing else did. She worked night shifts at the call center while Brian slept in a pack-and-play beside her desk. She debugged Lighthouse's expansion during the day while he napped on her chest. And when the city's contract scaled and the federal grant came through, when her equity vested and the payout arrived in her account like a whisper instead of a shout, she told no one. She just opened a new document and started drafting something the Bakers would never see coming. The Brian Elijah Trust, a vehicle that would never need their names, their approval, or their money. Everyone expected Marcella to lawyer up and demand the maximum child support the law allowed. She did hire a lawyer, a former prosecutor from her church, who wore comfortable shoes and a face that told liars to find another hobby. But instead of filing for support, Marcella did something no one anticipated. She funded Brian's future herself. Then she followed the money behind the smear campaign. Her attorney traced invoices from the anonymous account to a PR firm, to a subcontractor, to a donor fund that smelled like Baker from 3 blocks away. They preserved everything: screenshots, recordings, timelines that mapped cruel posts to custody negotiation deadlines. The pre-hearing settlement meeting was held in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above the Chicago River, where the Bakers believed altitude equaled advantage. Catherine arrived in pearls and poise, ready to negotiate terms. "I'm sure we can find a generous arrangement," she said, her smile calibrated for cameras that weren't there. Marcella slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A parenting plan, holidays split by tradition, a binder of Brian's allergies and routines, a standing Wednesday video call for story time if travel interfered. "I'm not here to price my son," Marcella said. "I'm here to plan his life." When Mrs. Baker reached for her usual tool, control disguised as concern, and murmured, "Let's not let this get messy," Marcella lifted her phone and pressed play. A recorded call. The subcontractor and a Baker staffer discussing dirty optics and narrative stabilization. The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Edward, who had been silent until that moment, finally asked the question that would crack his world open. "Mom, did you authorize that account?" Silence answered first. Then Catherine's lawyer cleared his throat and suggested they reconvene. But Marcella was done reconvening. The next morning, she dressed Brian in soft cotton and herself in white. Not bridal white, not surrendering white, but the white of clean slates and refusal to apologize. She walked into the Chicago courthouse carrying her sleeping son and a notarized document that would rewrite the narrative they'd spent months building. The courtroom was packed. Spectators who'd followed the social media storm filled the gallery, phones ready to capture whatever humiliation they expected. The judge, a black woman in her 60s with eyes that had seen every game played, asked Marcella if she'd reviewed the proposed child support schedule Edward's attorneys had filed. Marcella slid her document forward across the marble table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady as the pen in her hand, "I'm not requesting child support." The murmurs started immediately, a ripple of confusion, disbelief, vindication for those who'd called her a schemer. Edward leaned forward, his face a mask of shock, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Marcella continued, "I've already funded Brian's health care, housing, and education through an independent trust. I'm requesting a parenting plan, not a paycheck." She produced the trust documents, a letter from Brian's pediatrician, and then, a second folder. Her attorney stood and entered exhibits into the record: PR invoices, burner account registrations, and a timeline that mapped every vicious post to key custody negotiation dates. The judge's questions pivoted, almost imperceptibly, from Marcella to the Baker's counsel. What was meant to frame Marcella as a predator became an examination of coordinated character assassination. The gallery's whispers inverted: shock where there had been smugness, respect where there had been scorn. Marcella signed the final page of her parenting proposal. No flourish, no speech, just black ink on white paper, and a sleeping baby who'd never know how close they came to being someone's bargaining chip. The pen left the page. A mother chose sovereignty over spectacle. And the Bakers, for the first time in their carefully curated lives, had no narrative left to control. The courtroom's hum faded as Marcella gathered her papers. Brian's soft breaths a steady rhythm against her chest. The truth had begun to stir beneath the surface, a quiet current she'd shaped long before the Baker's whispers took root. It all began months earlier, when Marcella first crossed paths with Edward at a fundraiser where her quiet innovation caught his eye, unaware of the storm her strength would soon weather. That strength had been forged in the dim glow of a 911 call center, where nights stretched into a blur of ringing phones and weary voices. Marcella worked the late shift, her fingers tapping keys as dispatchers barked orders and paramedics scribbled notes between runs. The air smelled of stale coffee and resolve, a place where chaos was the norm and solutions were rare. But Marcella saw patterns: mental health calls routed to overworked cops, non-emergencies clogging lines, neighbors pleading for help that sirens couldn't solve. She sketched ideas on napkins during breaks, her mind a quiet engine. One night, she cornered a paramedic named Jamal, a dispatcher called Lena, and a social worker, Priya, in the break room. "What if we triaged upstream?" she asked, her voice steady over the hum of a vending machine. "Nudge callers to the right help before it's a crisis?" They stared, skeptical, but her whiteboard diagram, arrows looping from assessment to resource, hooked them. A lighthouse was born there, a stubborn idea scribbled in dry erase marker, built on the belief that nights shouldn't chew people up. The pilot launched a small test in 2 Chicago districts, where call volumes strained the system. Marcella worked it like a second job, coding between Brian's naps, tweaking algorithms while lullabies played. Jamal tested it on the streets, Lena logged data, and Priya connected callers to shelters instead of squad cars. The results came quietly: a 13% drop in non-emergency dispatches, a ripple that saved hours and lives. The city took notice, expanding the contract with a federal grant to fuel it. Marcella's equity vested in a payout she read twice, then ignored when Brian rolled over for the first time, his giggle worth more than commas. She kept it silent, shielding him from the spotlight, her wealth a tool, not a trophy. That money would later anchor the Brian-Elijah Trust, a lifeline she'd design with the same care she gave her code. Weeks after the pilot's success, Marcella attended a fundraiser, her thrift store dress blending into the crowd. Edward approached, his smile easy, his suit a quiet flex of privilege. They talked by the bar, books, travel, the way Chicago's winter light softened its edges. He didn't know about Lighthouse, and she didn't mention her Honda Civic or the studio apartment where Brian's crib sat. When he offered to buy her drink, she shook her head. "Split the bill, split the truth," she said, her tone firm but warm. He laughed, surprised, and agreed. Their chemistry sparked in that honesty, a rhythm of shared glances and unforced laughter. She mentioned Lighthouse only in passing. "I work on a project that helps the city," letting him fill the silence with curiosity. He did, asking questions that showed interest, not judgment. For a moment, it felt pure, untainted by the weight of names or net worth. But the night carried hints of what was to come. A donor in a pinstripe suit overheard their conversation, his glass sloshing as he leaned in. "With the right narrative, projects like yours soar," he said, his voice oily with intent. Marcella nodded, her smile polite, but she filed the word narrative away, its edge sharp against her instincts. She'd seen how stories could be shaped, her own thrift store roots already a target for whispers she hadn't yet heard. Edward, oblivious, offered to carry her coat, and she let him, their hands brushing as they stepped into the cold. The city lights flickered, a backdrop to a connection that felt solid. Until the baker's machine would test its foundation. Back at the call center, Marcella refined Lighthouse's code, her focus unbroken. Jamal brought her data from a night shift where a caller, redirected to a counselor, avoided a hospital trip. "You're changing things," he said, clapping her shoulder. She smiled, but her mind was on Brian, asleep at home, and the trust she'd built for him. Quiet wealth, independent of the gates she'd never passed through. The pilot's success was a secret she guarded, knowing its power lay in its purpose, not its profit. Yet that donor's word lingered. Narrative, a foreshadowing she couldn't shake. Love with Edward was a new variable, but her work was her constant, a shield she'd wield when the whispers grew loud. As dawn broke over the city, Marcella logged off, her screen reflecting a woman who'd already begun to outpace the story they'd tried to write for her. The fundraiser night replayed. Edward's laugh, the donor's smirk, and she wondered how long the purity of their start could hold. Lighthouse hummed in the background, its impact a silent victory. But the stakes were rising beyond romance. Her competence was her armor, her ethics her compass, and the wealth she'd earned a promise to Brian. The courtroom moment was still months away, but in those night shifts, Marcella had already laid the groundwork for the signature that would redefine her. The city lights faded as Marcella left the call center, Lighthouse's quiet triumph still humming in her mind. Edward's laugh from the fundraiser lingered too, a promise of something real amid the code and cribs. But as dawn gave way to the day, that promise would face the weight of the baker's world. A machine of donors, consultants, and optics that would test her resolve. The first crack appeared at a family brunch, held in a sprawling dining room where sunlight glinted off crystal and judgment hid behind smiles. Marcella arrived with Brian nestled in a sling, her thrift store dress a stark contrast to the tailored linens. Edward greeted her warmly, his hand brushing hers as he took her coat, the private Edward she'd come to trust. But the table told a different story. A cousin, impeccably dressed, guided her to a seat at the far end. "So you can keep an eye on the baby," she said, her tone syrupy with faux concern. Marcella sat, her posture steady, while a server poured water and the cousin whispered, "I love that you're so down to earth." The words landed like a pat on the head, a microaggression cloaked in manners. Across the table, Edward caught her eye and smiled, oblivious to the undercurrent. His public self, charming, calibrated, blended seamlessly with the room, while his private tenderness seemed to shrink under the family's gaze. Days later, the whispers turned digital. A social media post surfaced from an anonymous account, a screenshot of Marcella's thrift store receipt, with a caption, "Funny how affordability becomes a lifestyle when you know a trust fund is coming." The comments piled on, snide, speculative, painting her as a climber from the wrong zip code. Edward brushed it off when she showed him. "It'll blow over," he said, his voice steady but distant. The public Edward stepping in. Marcella nodded, her jaw tight, but inside the sting lingered. She hadn't chased their wealth. She'd built her own, quietly, through Lighthouse. Yet the narrative was taking shape, and Edward's dismissal felt like a shield he wouldn't raise. The next escalation came at a consultant's office, where a PR advisor joined a family meeting Edward insisted she attend. The room smelled of leather and strategy, a boardroom perched above the city. The advisor, a polished man with a clipped tie, leaned forward. "We need to control the conversation," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was the seed of an NDA, a tasteful document to protect the brand. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his private self flickering, but he didn't object. Marcella's fingers traced the pages, clauses silencing her about their relationship, her neighborhood, her life. The baker's machine whirred, optics over integrity, and Edward's silence was its fuel. She closed the folder, her voice low but firm. "This isn't protection. It's a muzzle." That night, alone in her studio apartment, Marcella rocked Brian as the city hummed outside. The advisor's words echoed, but so did the brunch whispers, the social media jabs. No one would muzzle her about her neighborhood, the South Side where she'd grown, where Lighthouse had taken root. No one, she vowed silently, her resolve hardening like code locked in a final draft. Brian's soft coo anchored her, a reminder of the stakes beyond romance. She'd built something real, and she wouldn't let it be erased by a brand-name family. The breaking point arrived with a doctored text, circulated by that same anonymous account. It implied Marcella had timed her pregnancy, a calculated move to secure Baker money. The message was elegant in its cruelty, plausible, unprovable, perfect for the platforms that thrived on insinuation. Edward called, his voice strained. "My PR team says it's just noise. Let it pass." But Marcella heard the machine behind him, the consultants and donors shaping his words. She hung up, her mind racing back to the fundraiser donor's oily remark. "With the right narrative, projects soar." The Bakers were crafting theirs, and she was the target. In the days that followed, the post gained traction, likes and retweets, piling like evidence in a trial she hadn't signed up for. Marcella scrolled through it once, then closed her phone, her focus shifting to Brian's sleep schedule and Lighthouse's next update. Edward texted apologies, the private man resurfacing, but his public silence grew louder. At a park meetup, he held Brian with a tenderness that clashed with the family he wouldn't confront. "It'll die down," he repeated. But his eyes avoided hers, caught between worlds. Marcella returned to her desk, the NDA folder unopened beside her laptop. The baker's machine was a puzzle, donors funding optics, consultants scripting lies, but she saw its seams. Her wealth from Lighthouse was a secret weapon, her ethics a shield. The doctored text was a spark, but she wouldn't let it ignite a fire she couldn't control. Instead, she drafted notes for the Brian Elijah Trust, her pen steady, her vow echoing. No one muzzles her truth. The city slept outside, unaware that a signature was brewing, one that would turn their narrative against them. As morning broke, Marcella logged into Lighthouse, her fingers sure on the keys. The brunch, the posts, the NDA, they were pieces of a game she hadn't chosen to play. But she'd play it her way, with a plan that owed nothing to the baker's gates. Edward's dual nature, private warmth, public retreat, loomed larger, a contrast she couldn't ignore. The doctored text buzzed on her phone again, a reminder of the storm gathering. Yet, in that quiet room, with Brian's crib beside her, Marcella knew the real power lay in what she refused to sell. Her story, her son, her sovereignty. The doctored text lingered on Marcella's phone, a digital scar from the baker's machine, as the city hummed beyond her window. Edward's assurances, "It'll die down," felt thinner with each passing day, a fragile thread between the private man she'd loved and the public figure he couldn't escape. The storm was gathering, but Marcella's resolve held firm, her pen poised to redraw the lines of her life. It snapped in her cramped apartment one evening, the air thick with the scent of formula and determination. Edward arrived, his suit crisp, carrying a folder he slid across the counter between a bottle warmer and breast pump parts. "It's tasteful," he said, his voice soft, the private Edward she'd known. The NDA inside was a web of careful words, silencing her about their relationship, her neighborhood, her pregnancy, framed as protection for the brand. Marcella read it twice, her fingers steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "You control optics," she said, sliding it back. "I raise a child." His eyes flickered, a mix of guilt and resignation, but he didn't argue. The baker's machine had spoken, and he'd bent to its weight. That night, she knew the fracture was complete. Separation came before Brian's birth, a quiet unraveling in the shadow of hospital visits and ultrasound scans. Edward visited, his hands gentle as he held her face, tears streaking his cheeks when he saw the first grainy image of their son. "I want to be present," he said, and she believed him. His tenderness with Brian, changing diapers with a clumsy care, calling him "my little guy," was real. But with his family, he weakened. The Baker's Council sent drafts heavy with optics, support schedules laced with control, and Edward nodded along, his private warmth drowned by public retreat. Marcella kept her own folder, labeled Brian, filled with vaccination schedules, pediatrician notes, lullabies that worked. She'd raise him alone if she had to, her love a shield the Bakers couldn't breach. The escalation began with the anonymous account turning vicious. Posts claimed Marcella gamed public benefits she'd never touched, each lie more pointed than the last. The comments swelled, cruel, relentless, turning her thrift store roots into a punchline. She scrolled once, then stopped, her focus shifting to saving every receipt. Screenshots, timestamps, a paper trail of the baker's smear. Edward called, his voice strained. "My team says it's strategy. Let it play out." But Marcella heard the machine whirring, the consultants scripting her downfall. She hung up, her vow, "No one muzzles me about my neighborhood." Echoing as she filed each piece of evidence, a quiet arsenal taking shape. Meanwhile, Lighthouse expanded, its quiet success a counterpoint to the chaos. The city rolled out the platform across more districts, a federal grant adding fuel. Marcella's equity vested, the payout arriving with an email she read twice before setting aside. Brian had giggled that day, a sound worth more than money. She said nothing online, refusing to feed the narrative, and worked offline instead. At a credit union, she met with a counselor designing the Brian Elijah Trust, a clean structure to fund Brian's future, independent of Baker control. Disbursements for housing, health care, education were tied to values she'd write into the code of his life. Financial literacy at 12, community service at 15. Seed grants for local hires. Her wealth was a secret weapon, built on ethics, not optics, and she guarded it like a mother guards a crib. The tension peaked one Sunday at church, the pews filled with familiar faces and soft hymns. Marcella sat with Brian, her mind on the trust documents, when a friend leaned over, Pastor Jane, her voice low but firm. "You need someone who sees the fight ahead," she said, nodding toward a woman in the aisle. Aisha Benbow approached, her comfortable shoes and steady gaze marking her as more than a congregant. "Ex-prosecutor, now community attorney," she introduced herself, her handshake firm. "I hear you're collecting receipts." Marcella nodded, a flicker of hope cutting through the storm. Aisha's eyes narrowed, sensing the baker's game. "Let's build a case," she said, and the air shifted, a promise of justice brewing. As they spoke, Brian stirred, his tiny hand clutching Marcella's sleeve, grounding her. Edward's mixed signals, tender with their son, weak with his family, loomed large, a contrast she couldn't reconcile. The anonymous account buzzed again on her phone, another lie gaining traction, but she handed Aisha the folder of evidence instead. The attorney flipped through, her expression hardening with each page. Lighthouse's success hummed in the background, a silent victory, while the trust took shape on her desk. The baker's machine had escalated, but Marcella's quiet strength was matching it, piece by piece. Outside, the October dusk settled over Chicago, the city unaware of the battle lines forming. Marcella rocked Brian, her mind racing with Aisha's words, "We'll turn their narrative against them." The NDA, the posts, the family pressure, they were a test, but she'd already begun to outmaneuver them. Her decision to go it alone wasn't defeat. It was sovereignty, a mother's choice to protect her son from a brand that saw him as a liability. Aisha's presence was a spark, and as they scheduled a meeting for the next day, Marcella felt the tide turning, not with noise, but with the steady hand that had built the lighthouse and would now defend her truth. The October dusk deepened as Marcella left church, Aisha's firm handshake still echoing in her mind. The battle lines were drawn, her folder of receipts a quiet arsenal against the baker's machine. Brian nestled against her, his soft breaths a steady anchor as the city buzzed unaware. The tide was turning, not with noise, but with the evidence she'd gathered, and Aisha's resolve to wield it. In a small office above a South Side bakery, Aisha spread the receipts across a scarred wooden table, the scent of fresh bread mingling with determination. She traced the anonymous accounts trail with the precision of her prosecutor days, following invoices from the vicious posts to a PR subcontractor, then to a donor slush fund reeking of baker influence. "They paid to bury you," Aisha said, her voice low, flipping a page to reveal a wire transfer time-stamped weeks before the doctored text. Marcella leaned in, her jaw tight, recognizing the pattern, optics over truth, a machine fueled by money and control. The power was shifting, rumor giving way to proof, and she felt the weight of her silence lifting. Together, they crafted a courtroom strategy, their voices steady over the hum of a space heater. "Lead with the trust," Aisha advised, tapping the Brian Elijah Trust documents, funding sources, child-centric disbursements. No baker strings. Show you don't need them, then hit the receipts. Marcella nodded, imagining the marble table, the gallery's gasp as she'd slid forward the notarized "no child support needed" statement. Aisha sketched a timeline, PR invoices aligning with negotiation deadlines, burner account logs mapping slander to strategy. The plan was surgical, a quiet reversal of the narrative they'd tried to impose. Marcella's wealth from Lighthouse, her ethics, her motherhood, they'd become her weapons, honed in night shifts and cribside vows. Amid the planning, Marcella turned part of her payout into a quiet win. She piloted Night Shift, a child care co-op for hospital workers and EMTs, its first site opening in a converted storefront near the call center. Mothers like Lena dropped off kids before dawn. EMTs like Jamal picked up after runs, their gratitude a soft hum against the baker's noise. Marcella oversaw it silently, her thrift store roots grounding the effort. A young mom hugged her one evening, tears in her eyes. "This lets me breathe." And Marcella felt the ripple, a community lifted by the same resolve that built the lighthouse. It was a victory they couldn't smear, a light the baker's machine couldn't dim. Meanwhile, Edward's world cracked. At a family strategy session, he lingered by the door, the private man straining against the public role. A consultant's voice cut through, crisp and cold. "Brian's a liability optic. Keep him out of the narrative." The words hit like a slap, and Edward froze, his certainty fracturing. He'd heard the whispers, nodded at the NDA, but this, his son reduced to a PR problem, stirred something deeper. He left without a word, driving to Marcella's apartment, his knock hesitant. "I didn't know it was this calculated," he said, eyes searching hers. She met his gaze, her silence a wall, knowing his tenderness with Brian couldn't erase the family he wouldn't confront. Back at Aisha's office, the attorney dialed a judge's clerk, securing a pre-hearing meeting. Glass-walled conference room above the river, she told Marcella, her tone firm. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., we'll lay the groundwork. Marcella nodded, her mind racing to the trust documents, the receipts, the co-op's quiet success. The Bakers' escalation, nastier posts, doctored texts, had backfired, their machine exposed by the paper trail. She rocked Brian that night, the city's lights reflecting off his crib, and reviewed the timeline Aisha had drawn. The subcontractor's voice on a preserved call discussing dirty optics would be their ace. The next morning, 5:21 p.m. on Thursday, October 9th, 2025, loomed as a pivot point. Marcella dressed Brian in soft cotton, her white dress a quiet armor, and packed the evidence folder. Aisha's strategy was clear. Let the trust disarm. Then let the receipts strike. Edward's crack, his dawning realization, hovered in her thoughts, a contrast she couldn't yet trust. The night shift co-op hummed with new sign-ups, a testament to her resilience, while Lighthouse's data fed the trust's foundation. The Bakers' machine had miscalculated, and Marcella's silence was now a blade. As she stepped into the cool evening air, the river's shimmer beckoned. The pre-hearing meeting would be a stage, the glass walls a mirror to the Bakers' tactics. Aisha's presence beside her was a steady force, the receipts a promise of reckoning. Marcella felt the shift, power no longer theirs to wield, but hers to reclaim. The conference room awaited, a battlefield where her story would begin to rewrite theirs, one document at a time. The river shimmered below the glass-walled conference room as Marcella stepped inside at 5:22 p.m. on Thursday, October 9th, 2025, Aisha at her side. The city's pulse thrummed faintly through the panes, a backdrop to the Bakers' machine now cornered by her receipts. The pre-hearing showdown loomed, a surgical strike against the narrative they'd woven, and Marcella's resolve was a quiet blade. Mrs. Baker sat at the head of the table, immaculate in pearls and a tailored blazer, her smile cordial but lethal. Her hands folded over a leather portfolio, she leaned forward, her voice smooth as polished marble. "We're prepared to offer a generous settlement," she said, sliding a document toward Marcella. "Enough to ease your circumstances with discretion." The words dripped with control, a bid to bury the truth under money and silence. Edward sat beside her, his suit crisp, his eyes flickering between his mother and Marcella, the private man wrestling with the public role. Marcella met Mrs. Baker's gaze, her white dress a stark contrast to the opulence, Brian asleep in her arms. She reached into her bag and slid a single page across the table. A parenting plan, its edges neat, its intent clear. Holidays split by tradition, a binder of Brian's allergies, a Wednesday storytime video call clause if travel interfered. "I'm not here to price Brian," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here to plan him." The room stilled, the plan's simplicity disarming the settlement's weight. Mrs. Baker's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on the portfolio, but Marcella held her ground, her focus on Brian's future, not their wealth. Aisha nodded, then pressed play on a recorder. The subcontractor's voice filled the room, crisp and cold. "Dirty optics need narrative stabilization. Push the gold digger angle. Tie it to custody leverage." The audio crackled with intent, invoices and timelines aligning in the silence that followed. Mrs. Baker's composure cracked, her eyes darting to the recorder, then to Edward. The receipts, proof of a machine paid to slander, turned the table. power flipping from rumor to evidence. Marcella felt the shift, her silence now a weapon honed by night shifts and Lighthouse's quiet winds. Edward's breath hitched, his face paling as the recording looped. He turned to his mother, his voice breaking the stillness. "Mom, did you start that account?" The question hung, raw and unscripted, the private man surfacing. Mrs. Baker's silence was an answer, her lips pressing into a thin line, her pearls glinting like armor. The room's temperature dropped, the river's reflection darkening as dusk settled. Edward's hands clenched, his certainty fracturing. The contrast between his tenderness with Brian and his family's tactics laid bare. He looked at Marcella, a plea in his eyes, but she offered no comfort. Her trust was in the plan, not his awakening. Aisha gathered the recorder, her gaze steady on Mrs. Baker. "We'll see you in court," she said, her tone final. Marcella rose, adjusting Brian against her shoulder, the parenting plan still on the table like a quiet manifesto. The baker's machine had miscalculated, their generous offer a hollow shell against the audio's truth. Marcella felt no triumph, only the weight of her choice, to protect Brian without selling his story. Mrs. Baker's silence lingered, a confession etched in the glass walls, while Edward stared at the river, adrift in his own reckoning. Outside, the wind bit as Marcella stepped onto the balcony, the city lights blurring in the dusk. The river darkened, its surface mirroring the fading sky, and she breathed deeply, Brian's warmth grounding her. She felt lighter, not because she'd won, but because she'd refused to lose herself. The settlement, the slander, the NDA, they were threads of a narrative she'd unraveled with a plan and a pen. Aisha joined her, the folder of receipts under her arm, and they watched the water in silence, the showdown's echoes settling into a new resolve. Inside, Edward remained, his mother's silence a chasm between them. The subcontractor's voice replayed in his mind. Liability optics. And he saw Brian's face, innocent, unscripted, against the family's brand. Marcella's words, "I'm here to plan him," rang truer than the trust fund he'd inherited. The glass room held the truth now, a cold mirror to the baker's tactics, and Edward's turning point was a crack he couldn't mend, with apologies. Marcella turned from the railing, the wind tugging at her dress, and headed toward the elevator. The pre-hearing had shifted the ground, her sovereignty intact, her story hers to tell. The river's dark flow mirrored her path, steady, unyielding, and as she stepped into the night, she knew the courtroom awaited, where her signature would seal what this moment had begun. The elevator doors closed behind Marcella at 5:24 p.m. UAT on Thursday, October 9th, 2025. The river's dark flow still lingering in her mind as she headed toward the courtroom. The pre-hearing showdown had steeled her resolve, the baker's machine exposed by her receipts and plan. Now, the marble table awaited, a stage where her signature would rewrite the narrative, her silence a blade honed by quiet strength. The courtroom resumed, the air thick with varnish and anticipation. The judge, a stern figure in black robes, leaned forward. "Miss Johnson, if not support, what do you want?" Marcella stood, Brian asleep against her sleeve, her white dress a quiet armor. She slid a document onto the table, the Brian Elijah Trust, its pages crisp with funding sources from her Lighthouse payout, child-centric disbursements tied to literacy, service, and local hiring. "No Baker control," she said, her voice steady, the gallery murmuring as the Trust's independence silenced their assumptions. Edward shifted in his seat, his eyes wide, the private man surfacing amid the public storm. "I ask for co-parenting terms, not money," Marcella continued, her gaze meeting the judge's. Stability and routine, holidays by tradition, a schedule for Brian's needs. She placed a binder beside the trust. Allergy logs, pediatrician letters, a Wednesday storytime clause. The simplicity disarmed the room, her priority on Brian's future over Baker, wealth a moral anchor. Mrs. Baker's pearls glinted, her composure brittle, while Edward leaned forward, caught between pride and shock. The gallery's whispers rose, a mix of awe and unease. The gold digger label fraying at the edges. Aisha rose, her presence commanding as she entered exhibits. PR invoices tracing the anonymous account to a Baker-affiliated slush, burner account logs, a timeline mapping posts to custody negotiation milestones. The subcontractor's voice, recorded in the glass room, echoed faintly in the documents. Dirty optics and narrative stabilization laid bare. The judge's gavel tapped, calling for order, but his focus pivoted to the Baker's counsel, his questions sharp. "Explain these payments," he said, his tone cutting through the defense's prepared script. Mrs. Baker's lips pressed tight. Edward's hands clenched, the machine's gears grinding to a halt under evidence's weight. Marcella stood still, Brian's warmth grounding her, as Aisha laid out the timeline. The doctored text, the thrift store smears, the escalation. All timed to leverage custody, now exposed as a calculated humiliation. The gallery's murmurs shifted, respect threading through where scorn had reigned. A woman in the back nodded. A man lowered his camera phone, the narrative flipping in real time. Marcella felt the reversal, not shouted but signed, her dignity a quiet triumph over the optics they'd imposed. The Baker's counsel stammered, their defense unraveling as the judge reviewed the trust's guardrails. Financial literacy at 12, community service at 15, seed grants for local hires. "This is unprecedented," he murmured, his gaze shifting to Mrs. Baker. "Miss Johnson's independence is clear. Your client's actions require scrutiny." The words landed like a gavel, the power dynamic tilting. Edward turned to his mother, a question in his eyes, but she stared ahead, her silence a confession echoing the glass room. Aisha handed over the final exhibit, a preserved call log linking the subcontractor to a donor meeting, sealing the case's pivot. The judge's pen scratched notes, his focus now a mirror to the Baker's tactics. Marcella adjusted Brian, her pen still warm from the signature that had started this, and felt the room's energy shift. The gallery's whispers inverted fully, soft claps, a muttered, "Well done," respect replacing the judgment that had filled the space. She hadn't sought applause, but the moral weight of her choice resonated, a mother's love outshining the wealth they'd wielded. Outside the courtroom, the city's lights flickered at dusk, the river a dark ribbon below. Marcella stepped into the hall, Aisha beside her, the trust and exhibits a testament to her resolve. Edward lingered, his face a mix of awe and regret. The private man she'd loved clashing with the family, he couldn't escape. The judge's pivot had turned the trial into a deposition on coordinated slander. The Baker's counsel now on defense. Marcella felt no vengeance, only the steadiness of her plan, Brian's future secured, her sovereignty intact. The gallery filed out, their whispers a new tune. Respect where there had been scorn, a story rewritten by a signature. Marcella rocked Brian, her mind on the night shift co-op. Lighthouse's hum, the trust's quiet promise. The Baker's machine had faltered, its optics shattered by evidence and simplicity. As she moved toward the exit, the marble floor reflected her steps, a path she'd carved with care, not conflict, her victory sealed in the silence of a mother's choice. The courtroom doors closed at 5:26 p.m. VWAT on Thursday, October 9th, 2025. The gallery's whispers of respect fading as Marcella stepped into the hall. The baker's machine had faltered, her signature and receipts rewriting the narrative, and now the aftermath would shape what came next. Brian stirred against her, a quiet anchor, as the city's dusk deepened beyond the windows. The judge's ruling came swiftly, his voice firm over the rustle of papers. He approved a balanced, child-first schedule. Holidays split by tradition, Wednesday storytime calls, routine anchored in Brian's needs. "Keep this child off the battlefield," he admonished, his gaze sweeping Mrs. Baker and Edward, then softening on Marcella. The trust's independence stood unchallenged, its guardrails, literacy at 12, service at 15, local hiring grants, a testament to her planning. The Bakers' counsel nodded, their defense muted, while Edward's eyes lingered on Brian, a flicker of the private man surfacing. The ruling was a pivot, consequences settling like dust, the machine's optics replaced by a mother's resolve. By morning, the media narrative flipped. A city blog blazed with "Single Mom Builds Trust, Not Drama." The headline, "A Quiet Victory Marcella Hadn't Sought." The anonymous account, its lies exposed by Aisha's exhibits, deleted itself, a digital ghost vanishing under the weight of evidence. Reporters lingered outside her apartment, but she slipped past, her focus on Brian's nap schedule, not their lenses. The shift felt surreal, respect where scorn had reigned. Yet she carried it lightly, her thrift store roots grounding her amid the buzz. Lighthouse's hum continued, its data a silent ally, while the trust's promise took root, untouchable by the baker's gates. Thursday arrived, and Edward knocked at her door, his first solo visit since the ruling. He carried a paper map of the Field Museum, marked in bright pen, a baby sling slung over his shoulder, his phone on airplane mode. The public man was absent, replaced by a quieter version, his eyes searching hers with less certainty. "I brought this for Brian," he said, unfolding the map, his voice soft. Marcella handed him the sling, guiding him through Brian's routine. Feed at 2, nap by 3, storytime at 4. He listened, nodding. No suggestions to improve, just absorption of her world. They walked to the museum, Edward carrying Brian, the map crinkling as he traced a path. It was a start, his growth tentative but real, a contrast to the family he'd begun to question. Back home, Marcella settled at her desk, Brian napping in his crib. An onboarding issue for Lighthouse blinked on her screen, users flagging a triage glitch, and she debugged it with the same care she'd given the trust. Her fingers moved steadily, code aligning as Brian's soft breaths filled the room. It was ordinary heroism, the quiet work of a mother and innovator, her wealth from the platform a tool, not a boast. The city outside buzzed with the blog's headline, but here, in the rented 2-bedroom with lemon oil on the shelves, her focus was on fixes, software, schedules, a son's future. The night shift co-op reported new sign-ups, a ripple of her resilience, and she logged it with a smile. A knock interrupted her flow, a mail carrier handing over a slim envelope. Inside, a handwritten note from Mrs. Baker, the script elegant but guarded. For Brian's heritage, a small piece. No apology, yet. But enclosed was a cloth-bound storybook, its cover worn, belonging to Brian's great-grandfather. Marcella traced it the embossed title, her thumb brushing leather, a subtle olive branch amid the tension. It wasn't reconciliation, but a crack in the machine's armor. A hint of humanity from the woman who'd orchestrated the smears. She set it on the shelf, undecided, her trust in the Bakers still thin, but the gesture lingered, a thread to unravel later. Edward returned Brian, the sling empty, his map folded with care. He loved the dinosaur room, he said, his voice steady, no trace of the consultant's liability optics. Marcella nodded, noting his effort, the co-parenting start credible if fragile. He lingered, then left, his phone still off, a sign of growth she filed away. The judge's admonition echoed, keep Brian off the battlefield, and she intended her plan, a shield against past conflicts. As dusk settled, Marcella rocked Brian, the storybook's presence a quiet weight. The media's flip, Edward's visit, the ruling, they were consequences of her choice, her sovereignty intact. Lighthouse's code saved, she opened the trust binder, its pages a promise fulfilled. Mrs. Baker's note sat unanswered, a bridge she might cross, but not yet. The city's lights reflected off the window, a mirror to her path, steady, unyielding, and she felt the aftermath as a new rhythm, ordinary, yet profound, her story hers to shape. The city hummed at 5:28 p.m., on Thursday, October 9th, 2025, as Marcella rocked Brian in their rented two-bedroom, the aftermath of the courtroom settling into a steady rhythm. The baker's machine had faltered, her sovereignty intact, and now resolution would root her story in care, not spectacle, a theme she'd lived through every quiet choice. The next morning, the night shift co-op opened its second site, a converted space near another hospital, its windows bright with new life. Mothers and EMTs streamed in, dropping off kids before shifts, their gratitude a soft hum against the past's noise. Marcella oversaw the launch, her thrift store roots grounding the effort, while the first teen stipend program kicked off from the Brian Elijah Trust's community clause. A 16-year-old, Jamal's niece, received funds for a local bakery job, her smile a ripple of the guardrails Marcella had written. Literacy, service, hiring. It was a victory unmarred by optics, love measured in stability, not headlines, and she logged the success with quiet pride. Weeks later, the holiday season brought a handoff with Edward, the first since the ruling. They met at a park, the air crisp with December's edge, Brian bundled in a coat. Edward carried the cloth-bound storybook from Mrs. Baker, its pages yellowed but intact. "Thought we could read it together," he said, his voice steady, the private man fully present. They set up a video call, Brian between them on a blanket, and took turns reading. Marcella's calm cadence, Edward's tentative warmth, his voice blending with hers so Brian heard both. The handoff was graceful, no tension, just a routine anchored in care. Edward nodded, a credible co-parent now, his growth a quiet echo of the museum map days. Marcella felt the shift, love redefined beyond the baker's brand. That evening, alone in her clean kitchen, Marcella opened the trust binder, its pages a promise fulfilled. She taped a simple statement inside the cover. "Real power is what you refuse to sell." Her pen's black ink a final seal on her sovereignty. The words captured her journey, from night shifts to courtroom, from smears to trust, her refusal to trade Brian's future for their wealth, a cornerstone of her strength. Lemon oil scented the shelves, the marble tabletop of Chapter 1 reimagined here. No audience to please, just a mother's space. Brian slept in his crib, his soft breaths a rhythm she'd protected, and she smiled, the statement a private vow. The kitchen's warmth wrapped her, a contrast to the glass room's cold truth. Lighthouse's code ran smoothly. Night shift thrived. The trust's stipends grew, all built on ethics, not optics. Mrs. Baker's note remained unanswered. The storybook a bridge she'd consider, but not yet, its presence a subtle shift in the family dynamic. Edward's visits steadied, his phone on airplane mode a habit. They're co-parenting a credible start. The media's single mom builds trust, not drama, had faded. But its resonance lingered, a narrative she hadn't chased. As dusk deepened, Marcella traced the trust binder's edge, the pen resting beside it, a callback to the courtroom's marble table. The sleeping baby, the black ink, the steady hand, now hers alone, no gallery to judge, no whispers to silence. The city's lights reflected off the window, a mirror to her path, and she felt the resolution, sovereignty over spectacle, love measured by care. The baker's machine had lost its grip, its gold digger label a ghost, replaced by a plan she'd forged with resilience. She rocked Brian, the kitchen's quiet a sanctuary, and thought of the journey, Lighthouse's hum, the co-op's growth, the trust's promise, Edward's grace at the handoff, the storybook's dual voices, the statement's truth. They were her legacy, not theirs. The judge's admonition to keep Brian off the battlefield had held, her choices a shield against past conflicts. The second night shift site buzzed with new families, the teen stipend a seed for more, and she knew the power lay in what she'd refused to sell, her story, her son, her dignity. Closing the binder, Marcella glanced at the crib, Brian's curls catching the light. The city slept outside, unaware of the quiet victory within. She set the pen down, her hand steady, and whispered to herself, a closing line echoing the hook. They had whispered gold digger. She answered with a signature and a plan.